Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, all right. It's like I always have to do it twice. We're going to do that again, though, because you all just left me hanging. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, thank you. See, I was raised by two Southerners, so I'm really big on this sort of thing. Thank you for coming out this afternoon. I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to have and for the film that we're going to see. I'll give you a little bit of context for it, although I feel like the most important context is readily apparent. No one really needs me to explain to them why this film is timely or why it is a work that we should be viewing here at Columbia Journalism School. But I'll tell you a little bit about how this came about and the conversations that have surrounded it and why I was so interested in making sure that we had this conversation here. A few weeks ago, actually a few months ago, it's just been a blur. I will tell you about this job. It's like I just wake up in the morning and go until I fall out. And then I just wake up the next day and do it again. I'm like, what day is it? And so a few months ago, I attended a kind of luncheon reception for the Tribeca Festival, which I didn't really kind of know how I got invited to it or what the point of it was. And I was seated at this table, didn't know anyone at the table, and I was kind of like, how long do I have to sit here before I can slip out? How long is it required, or if it's rude if you leave before this particular point in time? And so I just happened to get into kind of one of those semi-awkward conversations with the people sitting around the table. But then in very short order, I learned that I happened to be seated to the left of Nicole Shipley, who is seated right here. And in very short order, we got into a conversation about her work and what she is doing with Safe Space Films. And I was saying at that point I'm about to come in as the Dean of the Journalism School at Columbia. It's like, oh, we have to talk, there's so much overlap. And then, I was thinking about what kind of work, what kind of projects do you all have that we might be interested in screening here? And she mentioned Battleground. And at that point, we were kind of in the ellipses stage, where there was the suspicion that this ruling might come down based on the leak, but it had not actually come down. And so we didn't know where things were, where they stood. We're very clear now about where things stand. And so through that interaction, she put me in touch with Cynthia Lowen, the director of this film, this amazing film. And then we talked about how this film had come about. And once I got to see it, which took a minute, but when I eventually did get the time to actually watch the film, I thought that it was even more valuable, not simply for tackling this crucial subject matter, but for being exemplary to our students about how you can convey the internal complexity of an issue that people think they understand. The way that people come to the conclusions that they come to, and the way that people are driven to the actions that they take, is boundlessly interesting and boundlessly compelling. And whenever I meet people who are kind of skeptical about media and they think, oh, you all just basically go to your offices and make things up, I was like, we're not that good. Human beings are infinitely more complicated, and I think that this film does really an amazing job of conveying this. Even within the most dichotomous issues in American society right now, which is abortion is the kind of axis that American politics has rotated on for the past half century. There's still a lot of important storytelling to be done here. And so I thought, on the basis of that, it would be great to have Nicole here and to have Cynthia here and to have them in dialogue with our own faculty members, and I was very happy to have June Cross participate as well. And so I thought that in that context, there was nothing to do except for me to make sure that we had a space and to get out of the way. And so on that note, that is exactly what I'm going to do. We have the space here, and we'll see the film, and there'll be a panel discussion to follow after. And also I neglected to mention my colleague Nina Berman, who is here as well, and whose insights are always valuable. So I think that's it, and we'll start the film. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So I'm happy to welcome the producer-director of this, your director of the film, Cynthia Lowen. Cynthia was Oscar shortlisted for your film Bully, right? And
Yes.
As I recall, the year I was a DuPont juror, you also won a DuPont
Yes.
Columbia Journalism Award.
Thank you.
For your film Bully. Next to her, we have Nicole Shipley, who most famously that I recall, The Trial of the Chicago Seven.
Yes.
And A Private War I haven't seen.
You
but
should see it.
I'll have to take a look at it. Thank you so much, producer.
you.
And last but not least, Terry McGovern is a professor at the Mailman School of Public Health who specializes in issues of gender and reproductive rights. And long ago, when I was working on a film that I thought would never get funded, helped me a great deal. So we all know how important a producer with or someone with money is at the end of the day. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Cynthia, as I was watching this movie, I found myself arguing with many of the characters on the film, and I'm wondering how you so uncritically were able to capture their lives, and how do you, I think a lot of our students in the room would be inclined to start arguing with people who say things like, I'm not judging anybody, and then the next word out of their mouth is, it has to be illegal for everybody. So how do you approach people that I'm imagining you personally may disagree with, but keep the camera running and persuade them to give you access?
Yeah. So as you see this was a 20-minute segment of the film, and the full film is about an hour and 45. So this kind of dips into the world of 3 of the main anti-abortion subjects, and then there's also, or participants, and then there's also, of course, the voices of pro-choice people. And originally, when I began the film in Alabama, I was really struck by the just like bold and blatantly unconstitutional thing that they had done in 2019, which was to pass an abortion ban before Roe had been overturned, and it was utterly unconstitutional at the time. And I initially started filming with pro-choice people, but soon I became very curious about how they had done this, how all these anti-abortion lawmakers were passing these really, really extreme laws when 7 in 10 Americans support access to abortion. And at that time, I really was just very curious. I think was part of why there's kind of just hearing what they had to say was born a lot out of just curiosity, like what do they have to say about why they're doing what they're doing and how they're doing it. When I approached Marjorie, Kristen, and Teresa, what I said to them was that the influence over of the anti-abortion movement over American policy, culture, and legislation was a fact. Putting aside one's personal perspective or opinion on abortion, that they are a force in American politics and culture, and it's something that I thought was worth understanding and investigating, and that my sort of pledge to them was that I would depict them and their work and their perspectives in their own words and as accurately and completely as I could. And so that was the approach that really drove the film and drove, I think, as you probably can tell already from this, a very restrained editorial approach to really not caricature them. There were certainly things in our interviews that I challenged them quite directly on. What I found often was that their responses were sort of these canned propagandistic things that, as we were editing the film, we would allow them certainly to speak in their own words, but we wouldn't repeat propaganda, we wouldn't repeat misinformation, or things that weren't just quite obviously false, like we're going to adopt all the children and take care of all the women, like obviously they're not, but other misinformation we withdrew.
Okay. Were they suspicious of you?
No, I mean, I think that I wanted to, I think, offer them the respect that I would offer anyone who I'm working with in a documentary film, which is that I think it takes a great deal of trust to allow someone to come into your life with a camera. And I wanted to respect the fact that they took me at my word, that I was going to depict them as accurately as I could. And again, I think that's sort of why, I didn't want to caricature them. Even through the choice of the score and the music, we were very restrained in how we chose the score and the approach to that. So I think they suspected surely that from where I'm from, and the fact that I'm not obviously a person of, I don't sort of have a obvious faith affiliation or anything like that. I think they suspected I'm probably pro-choice, but they...
You never told them?
No, and they never asked.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Some of the students for life, the younger people asked, and what I said was that it is my goal for my personal opinion to not be part of the film, and that I don't think it really should matter, hopefully. But they never asked. But I had a very interesting conversation with Marjorie toward kind of the end of our filming together. She showed me a piece that had come out in the New Yorker, I believe. And she said, this writer is on the other side, but this is a piece that we were very happy with because we felt that it was accurate. And it was certainly I know where you probably land on this, but at least be accurate. Right.
And Nicole, how did you get involved, and how did you two find each other?
Yeah, I mean, I got lucky, that's for sure. But I was paying attention to Alabama, but again, these news cycles are 24-hour cycles, and I unfortunately have to include myself in the class of like a lazy liberal, where something will catch my attention, but then work takes over, life takes over, and I sadly just, I sort of moved on. And I also didn't think that they would be as effective as they were, but when, I guess it was 2021, when Texas followed suit, and I was like, this is really bad. And, at that point, I had been successful with independent production and been getting involved more in documentary because I thought I'd met some journalists who got into documentary, and I was like, this is really a great way for people to tell stories that aren't sensationalized, that aren't just clickbait. They can really get it out there. So I reached out to people in my network, and I was like, someone has to be following this story. Like, there has to be a filmmaker out there that has been covering this for a few years, and if you can help me find them, I want to know what they're doing and what's been going on. And that was how I got connected with Cynthia and Rebecca and the entire team. And I was shocked to see the footage that she had captured. I am like a diehard Bernie, like bleeding, just like, I'm a feminist, I'm a liberal, I'm all of the things. And she captured the other side. And I, at first I was like, oh gosh, I don't even want to watch it, I'm turning it off. But then I just was so activated in such a good way, where I was Googling everything, I was fact checking everything, I'm researching Susan B. Anthony, I'm seeing her connections to Donald Trump, Mitch McConnell, and I was like, how do I not know about this? How do I not know? And so I felt that I had been let down as a American by mainstream media. that no one had covered these women. Really, I mean, there's nothing by CNN up until recently with any of these people. And I felt like if I could help Cynthia and the team get their story out there, I had like a moral responsibility to do it. So that's
Okay. I guess I should back up and explain that you're a founder of Safe Space Pictures,
yeah.
which is a distribution company.
No, I mean, we sort of do it all. Yeah, we're a production company, and we come in at all stages of development, of production, and we oversee, you know, helping the filmmakers through distribution as well. But we typically partner with streaming services or networks to actually, like, you know, for the film to find a home. We don't distribute ourselves.
Okay. And Cynthia, had you worked with distributors like Safe Space before?
I would say Safe Space is absolutely unique and fabulously so in really championing films that are, you know, doing bold and, you know, new things and really standing behind both. Safe Space is both, you know, has been absolutely instrumental in us finishing the film and getting a film to the finish line, to, you know, to premiere at a festival, to be distributed is like just a huge lift. And Safe Space came in and was just utterly instrumental in us finishing the film. We couldn't have done it without you. But beyond that, I think what has been such a great, it has just been incredible, is that Safe Space is also supporting our impact campaign in a really, really meaningful way.
Can you just explain what that is? I'm not sure our students understand what an impact campaign is or why it's important.
Yeah, so for this film, as with Netizens and as with Bully, we really wanted to make sure that the film became a tool for really meaningful, measurable change beyond the screen. And so doing things like getting the film out into communities with community members, with, in this case, with reproductive justice advocates, with abortion rights advocates, with students, with advocates, civic engagement groups, and really being able to kind of capture the motivation and the kind of like infuriated, motivated rage that I think people feel after watching this film or a film like Bully, where you see kind of the systemic incompetence of the system at the time to deal with young people who are being targeted, and to really take that energy and drive it toward providing tools, resources, being able to screen this with your community and have a conversation that will help shift the needle, get people to the polls, break stigma, and bullying. All these things are kind of part of what an impact campaign is.
Yeah, and I would just add to that quickly, you know, again, with like a mainstream distribution platform, it's not guaranteed because they're really caught up on just the market. Whatever the times are of the market, that's going to influence the sort of recognition, the branding, the promotion you get for a project. And we structure our financing typically from 501c3s. So impact is really what we're striving for in all of our projects. And so it gives us a lot of leniency, where like for this project, for example, like we knew we had a timeline, like that we really, in order for this to be a tool, like Cynthia said, we had to get this out before the upcoming election so that people could, you know, be informed, be educated. We could work with senators, we could work with, you know, universities, all of this stuff to educate people and make a difference. And again, the impact campaign is instrumental. It's essentially just like grant given P&A. I think that's the best way to describe it.
Terry, I want to bring you in here. This I know as a professor who studies and is immersed in gender and sexuality studies and reproductive rights. How important, what difference do films like this make in public opinion? Is there any research that shows it actually changes the needle on the dial?
So, you know, that's, I know you, of course, because I was at the Ford Foundation and the Human Rights Unit doing HIV, funding HIV work, and we understood that we can do all the court cases we want. You can hand out as many pills as you want, but we need to shift people's understanding, right? So film is absolutely critical. And this, I think, is their evidence. It was always a joke at the Ford Foundation. How are you going to show that a film impacted people? You give out surveys. Very, very difficult in the kind of corporate, count each pill mentality to show how important film is. But of course, this is more important, I would say, than a lot of litigation, because it gets to people and it affects them, and it's more universal. So I think it's absolutely essential. And what's so interesting about this film is it actually kind of lifts the veil a bit. It was the first footage I saw of people sitting with President Trump or pre-President Trump, and you get them talking about how they kind of made a deal with the devil. And
that was
it paid off.
The opening words of the
Right,
film.
right.
I don't know. Often it goes by quickly, but I was like, oh, I'm so happy that the opening words of the film was, I made a deal with the devil for political power. Right. And it's like,
And later on,
I did too.
You actually do ask later in the film, in a clip that you didn't see, there's a moment where you say, well, how do you sit with yourself, knowing the kind of person that the 45th president was? How do you justify that to yourself? Can you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that was a question was sort of like, well, where do you end up? Where do you stop filming for something like this? Because we've had to change the end cards on the film. It was first, it looks like Roe's going to be overturned, then the draft leak, and then we had to change it again for Roe has been overturned, and now they've introduced a federal abortion ban, and so we have had to make some updates on the end of the film. But something that I knew I wanted to get was after January 6th. I really wanted to hear from Marjorie in particular, like, you made this deal with the devil, like, was it worth it? And as soon as she was just so unequivocally like, yeah, it was worth it. Like, look at all the federal judges we got. We got the Supreme Court. We flipped the federal judiciary. Like, I would do it again tomorrow. And that was something that I just felt like I needed to kind of, as soon as she said it in the way she said it, with just, for a quote pro-life person, without a lot of regard for the human life that was lost, or for our democracy, or for, she's very close with Pence and has been. Pence is her guy, and Trump she can't stand, but just that hearing them say, like, yeah, it's worth it, and just kind of like sort of enjoying or kind of reveling in this ill-begotten political power that has been accomplished through utterly and wholly undemocratic means is sickening, I think. And I hope other people find it sickening as well.
Yeah, there's been a real deal, and it's a deal not only with the devil, but with racist and anti-democratic forces throughout the country on this one issue. Terry, I want to come back to you. When you look at how the media has covered the abortion issue in the United States, what is it we're missing?
It's taken a really long time. I think it has finally shifted, but these states have the absolute worst records, right? On maternal mortality, on infant mortality. They oppose everything from sexuality education to Medicaid coverage, postpartum. I mean, it's endless. The foster care systems where many of these children will end up are riddled with abuses. Mississippi has 108 outstanding abuses. So it has frustrated the reproductive justice movement, and certainly me, for a very long time, that the media was not covering that blatant hypocrisy in this kind of, their language is, and of course at the Supreme Court argument, Justice Barrett talking about it's no great imposition because the children will just go to safe havens. The reality of safe havens are horrifying. So I think that finally the media is beginning to get into those details, because otherwise it's not a real conversation, right? It's just polarized opposites.
Right. Yeah, this binary. What do we miss? What are we missing when we look at the binary? Even if you look at how other countries have approached this issue, activists in other countries.
So, I mean, we have interesting examples from around the world, the Green Wave, Argentina, Mexico, Ireland, what has been successful in decriminalizing abortion. It's been actually conversations that bring up who's pregnant and who doesn't want to be, right? What are the very complicated issues that are happening? Sometimes it's rape, sometimes it's incest, sometimes it's a lack of understanding, sometimes it's, but conversations with people about how many children, how many women in your family have died in childbirth, how many babies have been born, what happened to the teenagers who got pregnant. I witnessed a lot of long conversations, and interestingly, very grassroots, not big organizations handing out the playbill on what you should say and what you shouldn't. And you see people shift, people who actually opposed abortion because of religion, actually starting to say, wait a second, there's something wrong. And the stuff that we read now, like ectopic pregnancies, all of this stuff comes up. It's in people's lives. So if we could connect better to the facts, right, as opposed to this kind of ridiculous refrain, we're saving a life, I think it becomes much more possible to shift people's minds.
Cynthia, as you were trying to sell this film, what was the reaction? You're basically distributing it as an independent film. Were there times when you were trying to get more mainstream, either through the networks or the streaming services?
If there's a streamer in the room, we're taking anybody. I mean, sort of all joking aside, I think the fact that we don't have an offer from a streamer is mind-boggling, like utterly mind-boggling. We are. I feel like every time I turn on the radio, it's something about how the overturning of Roe is like just a watershed moment in the history of this country, unlike any other. And yet, I think that we have been receiving some real reluctance. I think that with a lot of these streamers, they check their women's issue box, they check their abortion box. I think they're much more comfortable with films, perhaps that make people on the left sort of walk out feeling like, okay, we got it. Like, all right, we've came out on top here. It's all going to be all right. And I'm like, no one should be walking out of any film about abortion rights in America right now feeling like everything's okay, because we are in a crisis like we have never faced before. So we are, I think, in the process of proving that this is a film that audiences want to see, that audiences respond to, that I think we need to see at this time. And we were absolutely determined to make sure that the film was available to audiences in advance of the midterms, because it would have been such a failure for a streamer to say, okay, well, thank you very much. We'll air this in April of 2023. And, I think we would have felt like also, from the prerogative of Safe Space to make sure that we're making an impact, that films are making a difference. So we're taking the leap and doing this the way that we're doing it. And I think hopefully forging a path for other films that boldly speak to really important issues of the day, but in a way that perhaps some of the streamers are like, we don't know, we'll get back to you when we feel a little safer about it.
And I do want to just separate, because it is so interesting when we think about mainstream media. It's like, okay, like there's such a huge difference between like journalism and distribution platforms, because like the response that this film has received from the press has been incredible. I mean, we're talking the New York Times. We've been featured at least in 100 articles, since its premiere in June, and been on tons of podcasts. I forget I'm terrible with this, but the huge writers podcast, and obviously like even Jelani in the school bringing us in today. It's like people really care about this. I just don't know fully what the disconnect is with, I'm not going to say any names, but some of these networks. At first they said the characters were too fringe, then they said it was too on the nose. So I'm like, well, which is it? I don't think someone's fringe if they're taking my rights away. I mean, they might sound fringe, but they're effective at being fringe, so I think we should be covering them. And I just wanted to make that.
One of the characters that most surprised me, I think, was Teresa. Teresa, is that how I pronounce it?
Teresa, yeah.
Because I'd never really thought about Democrats who are pro-life. I mean, I know some. actually, but I'd never seen anyone like that pictured. And I wondered how she, like that moment where she says, well, I'm not judging anyone who's ever had to make that choice. And in the next breath, she says, but it should be illegal for everybody. How does she justify that in her own brain? I'm just, because you made a cut there, so I don't know quite what was said in the space, but I just, in my own head, I was just like, well, but wait.
Yeah, I mean, there's, oddly, I had, like, at first Teresa's like, you know, of course, she's such an outlier. You don't kind of expect all the things that she has to be anti-abortion.
I know a lot of people like that, actually, who are on that side.
Yeah, like, the thing that I will say is that, like, a lot of the hypocrisy of the kind of conservative anti-abortion people that, okay, fine, so you are anti-abortion and you're also against any kind of, you know, support for maternal well-being or infant well-being or environmental issues or being anti-death penalty, pro-gun control. So in this odd way, I was like, Teresa's kind of position is almost more consistent if the thing is like, well, typically this is like a complete hypocrisy. The position is so hypocritical when you don't actually then support the life that is. But she was, you know, I think she was raised in what she describes as a cult. I think she kind of takes positions that are somewhat unusual.
Contrarian, in other words.
Yeah.
She loves attention.
Yeah.
So, Terry, I'm interested. You spoke about how activists in other countries had started doing interviews with families. And how do we in the media begin to move the needle from focusing on the leaders of the movement to beginning to have those kinds of conversations? I mean, you spoke about doing investigations on places like Safe Haven, but just sort of talking intimately with families. How can we begin to move that needle?
So
I'm actually going to begin to open it up for questions. So begin to think about what you have. Yeah.
I think first of all, Kansas was super interesting, right? You had a state that went for Trump. You know, the numbers, the turnout. You saw some demographic shifts. It'd be interesting to talk to some of those voters. Michigan also, you know. So we are seeing shifts in people that supported Trump, but are also supporting abortion rights, access to abortion. So I think capturing some of that complexity, again, the more we get away from the polar opposites. Also, I think lawyers get too much attention in the coverage, actually, because it's what's really going on that people need to read about. I think in particular the criminalization aspect is so horrifying. I'm spending a lot of my time with HIPAA and, you know, in these small towns where, you know, there's an exception for criminal proceedings, court proceedings. So a statute that was created to protect people's medical information is now being used to prosecute people. And you have prosecutors who are, for the same person, having to deal with the sexual assault and also then having a case against the young woman and potentially her mother. So the ramifications of all of this and actually talking to people, not just having lawyers say, oh, 27 states are doing this, but what it's doing to people's lives, I think, is hugely important.
Are you saying that the HIPAA laws don't apply?
I'm saying that HIPAA does apply, but there is an exception.
There's an exception
to court proceedings, right?
Okay.
They don't apply actually to crisis pregnancy centers, which because they don't provide medical care, but they are the source of a lot of criminalization. So that's just, it's very tricky, right? So a lot of people are going into crisis pregnancy centers thinking they're getting information about how to proceed,
clinic.
right?
They think that they're clinics.
And they're
crisis pregnancy centers, for those who don't know, are places where they actually try to persuade you not to get a abortion.
But they advertise on
They
Google as
advertise
clinics.
like, if "Are you pregnant? We'll help you," and then you walk in, and the next thing you know,
Yeah.
they're persuading you not to get an abortion.
Or they're
Yeah,
calling
you're
the
an
they're
Oz.
calling the prosecutor, right?
Yeah.
They're sending the records over because they're not bound by HIPAA. Like HIPAA at least requires a subpoena or something. So very, very murky territory, and I do think it's really scaring people when they start to get the details, even people who thought they were not pro-choice.
Right.
So very important.
Cynthia, you had a scene that we didn't see that was in where you're shooting in a clinic in Alabama. Were you in Texas?
In Texas.
Texas.
Whole Women's Health in Austin.
Can you talk about it was sort of, we see the doctor, we don't really see any of the patients. Can you talk a bit about approaching shooting in clinics? I know you have the HIPAA laws as one thing that sort of stops a lot of us, but what other, just sort of thinking as a documentary filmmaker, if I want to go in and begin to think about how to approach these stories, what should I be thinking about?
Yeah, so right now, I have found that there is a lot of pressure to try to get into a clinic or get into a medical setting. And while I have had great responses from abortion providers who are really eager to talk, they want to tell the stories, they have patients who want to talk, what I have been hearing from outlets is, oh, but we want you in the clinic, we want you in the medical center. If you can't get in there, if you can't get us,
In the
fly on
room
the
while
wall,
the procedure is going on.
yeah. And my response to that is like, absolutely not. I won't do it, because you have people who could be facing criminal prosecution if they are seeing an abortion provider in Denver and then flying home to Texas, and someone subpoenas my footage or sees the film and sees, oh, that person, my neighbor, was in the waiting room in that clinic in Denver. I'm going to sue them under the Texas law. So I think that this is a moment to really, as documentarians and as journalists, to really hear what the medical providers are saying and what the people who are seeking medical care are saying about how they feel they can safely participate in projects that tell their stories. But that at this moment, I think trying to enter the medical providing setting, unless there have been a lot of safety precautions put in place and everyone associated with the project is completely on board with you being in there, I think it's important to really push back on those editors who are saying, no, I want to be in there. I want to see, I want that sensational. It's sensationalizing it, and I really, at the expense of people who are risking. I had dinner last night with someone who has a good friend who just left Texas. She was about 20 weeks pregnant, had a miscarriage at 20 weeks, had to drive 11 hours to New Mexico to get treatment. Upon returning home, they packed up their house, which they owned immediately, after speaking with a lawyer who said that her husband could be prosecuted for aiding her in getting an abortion by driving her to New Mexico for this emergency. And she has left the state. She will never go back. That is what is happening. That is what is happening. People have to leave their home, leave their state, leave their jobs, because they could be prosecuted criminally for seeking life-saving medical care. And it's so real. And I think that respecting that in how we tell these stories is important.
I have like 3 places I want to go, and I'm trying to think. Anybody out there have a question while I'm trying to sort this out? Yes. Oh, there's a microphone in the back. Yeah. I think what I was thinking about asking was like, well, I'll wait until you ask your question.
Yeah, sure.
And then
Thank you.
I figured
Can you
it
hear
out.
me?
Go ahead.
Thank you for being here. I'm a student, and I'm Anna. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
A number of times it's been mentioned that the media has not been covering, quote unquote, the other side, right? The pro-life side. And even before Roe v. Wade was overturned, and even to a certain extent now, why do you think that is? And also, the other question unrelated to that is, have you gotten feedback from the pro-life side after them watching this film?
Do you want to jump in about why you think?
I mean, I have a few ideas as to what is going on. I think when it's interesting, I'm working on another film somewhat unrelated to this, but it's about women in art. And what we found is that the institutions at the top of the food chain that have the most funding, the National Gallery and all these other organizations, that's where change is the slowest. But it's the smaller institutions on the ground. They have 80% women doing solo exhibitions, and all of this amazing change is taking place. And so when you have a film like this and you're dealing with the top of the food chain when it comes to networks and stuff, I mean, if you look at their political affiliations, a lot of the time they're playing both sides of the fence. I don't know how that fully comes into play with who is determining all of the stories that get front and center and get the most attention. But I think it'd be silly to assume it isn't a factor at all. So that's just a theory that I have because, again, like I said, you see these journalists, the people who are working at the newspapers and other, on websites, they are covering the film. They are giving the film attention. But I think that, change moves slowly at the top, unfortunately. And then I'll let Cynthia jump into the second part of the question.
Yeah, I mean, I would also just say there's a difference in covering sort of, because something I have seen since this has been so much in the media, sort of a he said, she said, oh, it's just two sides of it, without the context of no, this is actually an effort to here are these people, here's what they say, but what they're actually doing is undermining the democratic process and implementing things that are against the will of the majority and letting people get on the air and spew total misinformation. And that, I think, is super problematic, and I definitely do not support that kind of coverage of the issue. I think up to this point, it was hard. We had Alexis McGill Johnson, who's in the film, who's the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, at our Q&A when we premiered. And what she said was there's been something called a believability gap, that it's just been so hard to believe that something that the pro-choice movement has been fighting was the believability gap, that it was possible Roe could be overturned, that it was possible that these folks might amass so much power. And I think that has been part of the failure to kind of zero in on it and be wait a minute, what are they doing and how are they doing it? And what's the danger lurking kind of right beneath the surface here? And so I think perhaps that's been why they just haven't really wanted to look at who these groups are and how they're doing what they're doing. They have seen the film, and they are good with it. Teresa wishes she was playing more guitar. But other than, I think that was sort of the major critique from Teresa. But Marjorie and Kristen, I think, both feel that it is an accurate portrayal of them and their work.
You were fair and it's accurate.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm interested in how they respond to these questions about ectopic pregnancy or people having to leave the state when you have to get a medical procedure. How do they respond to that?
I think there's two responses. One that I've been seeing, which is very interesting, is that I get emails from various anti-groups, and I've been getting a few that say ectopic pregnancies, if you terminate an ectopic pregnancy, it's not an abortion, which I found really interesting. I'm oh, they realize they have a branding problem when people start dying because they couldn't get care for an ectopic pregnancy. So the other thing that I saw from one of these big groups was that Chrissy Teigen, about a week and a half ago or so, said, I actually had an abortion. I terminated my pregnancy when there was a, major complication. And I got an email from one of these groups saying, but was it an abortion? And I'm she just told you, I think so. I think she knows. But, kind of seeing that they are trying to sort of maybe make the language around what an abortion is a little squishier so that they have maybe a little room to maneuver once they start to see the catastrophic fallout from this.
I always tell my students, be careful about doing a story that's breaking around you while you're still trying to film and you're in that situation. The story has advanced even since, when did you wrap? Since July?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we just had our last. I can ask our producer, Rebecca Stern is here, as is our co-producer, Steffi Van Ree, who have both been deep in the trenches on
So, like,
this.
I mean, the context of the conversation is changing even
Yeah.
as the film is still being
Yeah.
seen. And how do you keep up with that? You know, or how do you recontextualize the film even as the story is advancing?
Well, there's the parts of it that I think at this point we're done, no more changes. But I think that watching the film now, when Roe's been overturned, like it's almost more chilling than it was when we first started watching
Sadly,
it.
evergreen. It's appearing to be.
Hearing them say 2020 will be the year that we become the first post-Roe generation. Hearing them say that and knowing it was the year that they became the first post-Roe generation. It's just, so I think as our world has changed and the film has sort of stayed as a little bit of like this, not a little bit, like a harbinger. Yeah, in a way it's almost
I'm
more.
sorry, did you have a question? I would love to hear your question.
Thank you so much for the film. My question is, what's their agenda post Roe and Dobbs, or do they have an agenda beyond abortion? Because I can't imagine these groups who have such an identity for so many years in their lives. I mean, their entire social structure revolves around ending abortion. What do they do once they've won? Where do they go from here?
Right, they can't stop because they also need to continue to get funding for their organizations. So
She says in the film that they want a federal ban. Right. Yeah.
Federal ban.
They'll figure it out.
They'll
No, I mean, they
figure it
said
out.
that. They said
Contraception.
it multiple times where they're like, we can't control. I mean, look at all this fallout happening, but they're just like, we'll figure it out. We just have to advance the mission. Like, they're so issue driven. They just care about like one outcome. But I don't know. You can speak better. I just had to say that what they said in the film was, like, to me, shocking. Like, we'll figure it out when we get there. We'll take care of the women when we're there, but we have to advance the moment. The time is now.
So emergency contraception, which is not an abortion, it's keeping the pregnancy from happening, right? There are already many states that they're introducing these provisions. So I think
University of
it's
Idaho
getting
just banned
crazier
it.
and crazier. So I don't think they'll stop. First of all, I don't think they're having much success in the states that are tightening their protections for people coming from out of state. But all of the states where it's still legal, huge target. But they're also going down the slope to contraception, emergency contraception, obviously LGBT, all the kind of protections that are about substantive due process are up for grabs, and you can just follow what's being introduced where to see what their agenda is. I'm sad to say.
I have a question. I also want to make sure that I apologize for not acknowledging Professor McGovern at the outset of the program. So I was kind of like trying to do a bunch of things at once, and I sat down and was like, oh. But your contributions have more than kind of pointed out the significance of you being on this panel. We had a conversation about this film and the context in which I saw it. And it, to me, reminded me, the Dobbs decision reminded me of the Fugitive Slave Act. And the reason I said that was that for many people, particularly people in the North, slavery was something that they found disagreeable, but this is in another region, it's not in our community, and they just found ways to reconcile themselves to its existence. It didn't impact their daily lives. The Fugitive Slave Act changed that and created a federal bureaucracy charged with tracking down people, dragging them back into slavery, many of them people who had lived in communities for years, decades, and all of a sudden this issue became personal. And this attempt to bolster slavery had the opposite effect. It made people who had previously just passively disliked slavery into raging abolitionists. I wonder, one, what you think about the prospects of those sorts of things happening in the aftermath of Dobbs. And two, if you ever have any thought to, because this is such a kind of moving target film, if you ever have any thought of revisiting this, in however many years, I have whatever time frame to chronicle how the story has unfolded since this moment.
Thank you for that question.
Recovering from this one, right?
Yeah. In the process of making this, I can't tell you how many times I would say to someone generally, a woman in New York, who's a sort of generally, basically politically engaged, sort of paying attention person, I think they're going to overturn Roe. I think they're going to do it. And the response would be, oh, well, that will never affect me because abortion will always be legal in New York. And that response, I heard that from, women living in states who had not for the past decade been the targets of anti-abortion legislation that's been being passed and that's made America a post-Roe nation in many states before this. And that was always just like jaw-dropping to me. It's like, you live in the United States of America. You don't live in New York. Like, you might reside in New York, but you live in the United States of America, and the rights of your fellow Americans, and when those rights are eviscerated, should matter to you as much as it would matter if that right was taken from you or someone under your own roof. And I think that finally, that, oh my gosh, it could be me. It could be my body. It could be my daughter's body. It could be my sister's body. But I think that the failure to appreciate that is deeply seated in racism, in economic inequity, in this sort of disparity of rights that people are experiencing in this country.
Poor women have not had access to abortion ever since the Hyde Act in 1985. Yeah. So it's not like, there has always been a class of women for whom abortion was out of reach unless they somehow had a fairy godmother somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's something that's too often, I think, not talked about. Yeah, Terry.
I was just going to say, I think the point that you're making, though, first of all, I've read that they were looking at the Fugitive Slave Acts when they drafted Texas. So you're absolutely correct. And I think, one of the most moving things I did was I attended a meeting of prosecutors. There's an association of prosecutors, and there's a subgroup that, not surprisingly, mostly black women who are saying, we will not prosecute these cases. We will not. And actually, we're saying to us, I am a lawyer, you need to deal with HIPAA because we cannot have these records, right? You need a case. So I think that they've overstepped with this criminalization. So it may, let's hope that it has the same effect that you described, that they've overstepped. I don't know. That is dependent upon those stories getting out there. And it is dependent upon very brave people who are stashed everywhere in this country. So I tend to have hope about that.
Yeah, me too. I just think that, one thing about abortion, and something that I don't say lightly, and we never talk about this lightly, when it comes to destigmatizing abortion, and how there are men who are affected by abortion, not just women, and they should be coming forward to talk about these stories, because something I imagine would be different with the Fugitive Slave Act is when you're dealing with something as different as race, that's very transparent. That's easy to see, especially in a time where we were suffering from slavery in this country. And when it's people who have had abortions, that's something no one really needs to talk about or share. So I hope it has the same effect. We're seeing a big, it could be a wave. And I hope for that. But again, I worry that it might take really catastrophic damage in order for it to become clear for the people who do have the privilege of knowing they'll be able to get it or not have to talk about it.
Yeah, there's a statistic that comes out. Alexis is talking about, there used to be this billboard as you came up the West Side Highway from the East Village that said the most dangerous place for a black American to be is inside the womb. And when she talks about this billboard, and I remember seeing it as well. So when you look at the statistics of, this is based on some data that you can find somewhere online that shows that Black Americans get more abortions than other people, but Black Americans are more likely to be poor, more likely to be covered by Medicaid, which makes them automatically ineligible for federal funding to get an abortion. I mean, there's so many, it's one of those correlation is not causation kind of conversations. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Frances and I'm a student here. And we're learning now about finding a really emblematic anecdotal lead to our stories. One person's story that really encapsulates it all. But when we think about how many women have abortions, and including in the US, I think it's 1 in 4 women will have an abortion in their life. How do we find the line as journalists between telling the exceptional stories or the really emotive stories about, rape and incest and ectopic pregnancies or other non-viable pregnancies with the stories of women who just simply don't want to have those pregnancies?
I would just say I think there's so much room for different approaches. This was sort of one approach to this subject matter, which was kind of getting, kind of investigating the antis. But yeah, I think that there's so many there's the sort of extraordinary cases, as you were saying, and then there's the cases of people who feel like this was a decision that happened and it wasn't a huge event in their lives and they've moved on. And I think there's room for all of those stories. I would just say that I hope that there's platforms for all of those stories. And that to me feels like the challenge right now is that there's often this kind of like, oh, well, we've done our story on that for this month and we don't have space for that. Or, and I think the challenge is making sure that, as the anti said, we won't stop. They're not going to stop. They're going to keep doing what they're doing. And that Roe was not the end by any means of what they're doing. And I think for us, it's continuing to get the many different facets of this story out.
Something that I think about in terms of, being a financier and I want to cover the issues, but I want to cover them from perspectives that I think the most people will be able to watch. And from, our team and our take, it's that we wanted a bird's eye view of the issue. We wanted to see how it was being weaponized for policy versus, I think, and this is, again, just my personal opinion, I think for a lot of people, 1 in 4 women, if they are, putting on a story that immediately takes them into the clinic or into the room, or if it's about someone's tragedy, they might shut down. I see people shutting down a lot when it comes to news and content because it's just painful. It's triggering for people. And so I thought with Cynthia and, the whole team's, I thought it was just a brilliant approach because I was like, this isn't going, it's upsetting. You feel, if you're a pro-choice woman, you feel violated, but you can handle it, and you understand what's at stake on a broader scale. And so that's just something as someone who, backs stories that I like to think about,
And not thinking about it as a binary. There's space between rape and incest and inconvenience. There's a whole world of gray in between there.
And also, frankly, if you're in a state that it's now illegal or criminalized and you're doing it just because you don't want to have a child, you're still there's plenty of horrible facts that you're going to face. It's highly dramatic that you have to travel 200 miles, that you might be prosecuted, right? So it's all, I think, reportable.
Hello, my name is Andres, faculty in CUNY. I guess I have a follow-up question maybe to some of the questions and comments that have been made about kind of the intersectional gender and race dynamic at play. So there was a very interesting article in Politico in 2014 about the origins of the modern evangelical movement in the 1979 election, Carter and Reagan, and how they started making abortion and this pro-life position as the surface issue, but really it was the segregationist coalition coming together and continuing that agenda. So I guess my question is, was there a feeling that those political positions and that vision was still there, is that some insight about like what happens next? I know with the ruling, there was chatter on, whether interracial marriage was next, same-sex marriage, et cetera, right? Is that something that continues to be visible and present in the work that was done?
Want to speak to that? Or I can speak a little bit too.
Yeah, I'll go after you.
Okay. I think one of the things so there was a tape of Trump meeting about a month before the 2016 election. He met with this room full of leaders of the Christian right. And you saw at the top of this clip a section from that meeting in the room. And I was able to obtain the recording that had been secretly recorded by someone who was in the room, who gave it to someone who then provided it to me. And what was interesting about that meeting was that they talked actually very little about abortion. They talked a lot about trans rights. They talked a lot about LGBTQ rights. And they talked a lot about wanting churches to have, and Christian organizations to have, a lot more rights. And what kind of that gets kind of coined as like religious freedom. And really what is at the core of that is, quote, the freedom to discriminate. And that was something that was just, like, I could do a whole nother film with like the other part of that. But that was so like, what they mean by religious freedom is that they want to be free to fire a teacher because they're gay. They want to be able to fire people because of their ethnic background. They want to be able to fire people because they are trans. They want to be able to fire people on the basis of their discriminatory values. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think for them, abortion is just a vehicle to getting voters. That's all it is. I think for them, they just feel like it's a tool that keeps working, and they just keep pushing it. But at the end of the day, they want to end the separation between church and state and implement their idea of what a Christian nation would look like.
Just also one thing that's very clear is if you say, the projections are it's 21%, black women are going to die at a 21% higher level post-Roe and maternal mortality. You give all these numbers, it's very apparent they don't care. Maybe that's what they want, right? So, immigrants, it's all, if there's ever a moment where we need to understand that everything is related, everything is connected, right? Which is, of course, what reproductive justice talks about. But now, if you want to figure out what's going on in Oklahoma, in a county, you have to figure out who elected the prosecutor, were they appointed, look at the campaign finance, look at the judges, look at the gerrymandering, right? It's all connected, and you're going to see that some of the same money that is putting all the industry in communities of color and protecting those companies, it's the same people. And I think we finally need to understand that our strategies have to absolutely address that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Hi, my name is Tamia Folks. I'm a student here at Columbia, and thank you all for being here. This has been really informative and incredibly helpful. I'm wondering, just because you said earlier in the conversation that you were really eager to get this out ahead of midterms, how you think we can, focus people on issues that matter. I feel like, especially in the last couple of years, politics has become very reactionary, and sometimes people's engagement with political issues can be dictated by the most catastrophic event that happens in the weeks or days before an election. And so for you, what has it been like kind of trying to keep people engaged in this conversation and maintaining their focus on this issue?
Thank you for your question. Something that I think was really motivating for me watching this was how strategic the antis are around kind of like every election, whether it is a big sort of national presidential election, Senate elections, gubernatorial elections. Like, they've been very, very focused and now we're seeing this on school board elections, where you have these kind of like right-wing school board takeovers by people who don't want to have sex education and all these other things. And my hope is that I think seeing how politically kind of focused they are, that it can help people who perhaps feel, disillusioned with, I think a lot of people feel quite disillusioned with our democracy and with representation and with the extent to which we are living in gerrymandered cities and states, and it can kind of feel like, well, does my vote matter? Will it matter? And what I think comes out of this is that, like, we have to keep pushing. We have to keep showing up. They're sleeping outside the Supreme Court in the rain. It was kind of interesting seeing that, because the pro-choice folks were not sleeping outside in the rain by any stretch of the imagination. Like, that was
This
not
was also
happening.
they could be in front so that they'd be in the prime media position the next day.
Yeah,
They were working together across state lines.
Yeah, like something I think I said to you, or like along the way, our producers are saying, like, there's no like cupcake sale that's like too small for them to like show up and kind of use it in some way to like get people to go out and do something. And so I think, my hope is by seeing that like the opposition is organized, they're showing up. If people who are in support of reproductive justice and abortion access, if we don't show up, they're just gonna keep going. We kind of have to.
We have to bring it to a close, unfortunately, because there's another event in this room in a half an hour. But I just want to, just sort of in terms of wrapping up, I think the lesson that I'm hearing from all of you is the importance of intersectionality, and within a room full of reporters who are being told by their professors constantly, focus, 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 focus. How do we become reporters who bring intersectionality into our stories and yet also keep the stories focused on an issue at the same time? I know this isn't your job, but I'm throwing it out there because I don't know how I would explain that to my students right now. Terry, you're the professor here. We can start with you.
What's the question?
How do we insert intersectionality into our stories without losing the focus, without losing focus on what it is we're talking about? So in other words, we're doing a story about the anti-abortion movement, but there's so many other issues that are involved here that seem to be.
So of course, I mean, obviously just in a person's being there, they have all these intersecting impacts on why they're in the situations they're in, right? So that's one part of it, but also really deconstructing, if there's a prosecution, how did that prosecutor get there? How was that person elected? Who paid, like going really far into how these people, because it's gonna lead you to these people we saw in film, right? Which should be instructive to our side. So I think the intersectionality is not just kind of showing how the individuals impacted are affected by all these different things. It's also, the intersectionality of all these siloed areas of fighting for justice. It's all the same.
I would just say one thing that I've loved in like researching so many great stories and having them presented to us is I love when people have a through line. Like it could be one character, it can be one story, but then underneath you have a footnote of data. Like I love these pie charts, and I think it's been so instrumental in moving the needle forward, socially, not unfortunately politically. But like just having, again, a pie chart of like what are the stats of these people who are financed by the Christian right and how they are taking over the federal judiciary. Like just having those numbers at the bottom as like a footnote to your through line, to your one story, it really gets people's attention, and it doesn't take away from the main point of what you're trying to say.
Cynthia, you have anything you want to add?
I would just say that I think probably every story has many layers. And, keep unpacking the layers, keep pulling back the layers, stay curious. And,
Okay. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank
coming.
you.
Thank all of you
all
for
so
coming.
much.